Hi, and thanks so much for joining this Sierra Bible Church Sermon of the Week. We hope you enjoy this message by Pastor Jason Rivera.
Here we go. I'm excited. Today we are celebrating our graduating seniors, so we're going to give them one quick clap. Yeah, that's awesome. We get to see what God's doing in their lives. You know what today feels a lot like to me? It feels a lot like a family gathering. You know those gatherings that happen, right? They happen in the holidays or reunions or special occasions. For me, I love family gatherings. We always have them at either my sister's house or our house or one of my wife's sister's houses. We all get together. We all play games. How many of you guys have ever played pickleball? Doesn't it change your life, the game of pickleball? It really does. It's super fun. So this Easter, we played pickleball, and I loved it. And it was really a great, great time. Inevitably, what always happens at one of these family gatherings is that my kids will put on a play. A play. And if I'm being totally honest, they're not great. But this year, something got me. I was sitting back watching the play, and I see my niece Aubrey, who's 17. She's no longer in the play. My son Ryden, who's 16, he's no longer in the play. The one that got me was my two nephews, Nate and Kaylin. Just not that long ago, they were in the play, but now they're not. And what happens in life is that we kind of go through these seasons where you're trying to decide where you fit in, which is what we're going to talk about today, a place at the table. And then right after the play comes my favorite part, as you can tell, the food. Oh, yeah. Thank you, John. The food is fantastic. I love the food, obviously. I already said that. But what happens at our family is maybe something that happens at your family tables too. It's this. We all get our food. There's one adult table. You know, they have like the nicer plates, maybe the centerpiece, tablecloth for sure, napkins, matching silverwares, bigger portions, all those things, right? And then you come over here to the kids' table. The kids' table has some things, maybe some coloring crayons and pens on the table, and then you have plastic plates, and you have sippy cups for the younger ones, or Bella. I know, me too. So there's these two separate tables, and they work, right? They kind of work. It makes sense, right? Inevitably, what happens with my table, or sometimes what happens at my table is, or my kids' table is, they're just walking to the table and they spill the entire plate of food. You're like, how did that happen? You didn't even make it to the table. But what happens is you have two very different experiences between these two tables, right? Like the adult table, you're kind of talking about maybe how grandma and grandpa met, or you're talking about different family things. Maybe you're touching on politics, just touching. Maybe just all these different adult table conversations, right? At the kids' table, though, you have laughter and fun and games and crying. And sometimes fighting, right? You have all of these different experiences that happen at the table. One meal, two tables, two totally different experiences. And it works. This week, we celebrated my daughter's 14th birthday, and we went to the Standard Pour, and I was a few minutes late. Don't judge me. It started at 7. I got there at 7:02. It's totally fine. I was working. No big deal. I walk in, and I'm like, this sermon's going to preach itself, because literally we had an adult table and a kids table. And then you kind of end up with a few of the teenagers moving towards the adult table, and they're cool because they're teaching you words like skibbity, and I still have no idea what that means. I probably just said a bad word on stage, but hopefully not. I'm the youth pastor. I can get away with that kind of stuff. But things that happen is you kind of miss out on the two different experiences. The kids' table misses out on the stories of how grandma and grandpa met and fell in love. They miss out on the stories about how your parents, never me, your parents made the same mistakes that the kids are making now. You know how we never did that? All of us adults in this room, we never made the mistakes that my kids made. Mom, zip it. But you miss out on things. And interestingly enough to me, the church, the family of God, has a similar setup. We kind of do a similar thing, right? We have 2 tables or 3. We have the kids' table, the youth table, the big church table. I still call it big church. I don't know why. I just do. I was telling people this week, I'm preaching in big church. I'm really grown up. I'm not. But it's kind of clear, right? You're invited to the meal, but it's not necessarily, you're not eating at this table. Now, I will say the Sierra Bible Church does this dual table thing really well. I'm really proud of how we allow students to sit at the big table, big church, all this different thing. But at some point, we have these teenagers who they ask themselves the question that every group or family asks, when do you get to move to the adult table? And maybe they ask, where is my table? At what place? Where do I belong? And this is why I think we have to have a conversation like this. To be able to start to learn what it looks like to join in to the adult table. Today we're celebrating our graduates, like I said, and it's an exciting time for our students. It's the time when they begin to ask, right? Which table do I belong at? And the truth is, high school graduation is not only the most difficult transition in a teenager's life, it's also one of the most difficult transitions in a teenager's faith. Research shows that teenagers are leaving faith at an alarming rate. Some studies show that nearly 50% of students who have grown up in kids' church and gone to youth group will leave the church and leave their faith. That's only one study. There's 2 other ones that show 60% and another one that yet shows 70%. That's a lot. That's a lot. And so where is the imbalance? I think a lot of it has to do with the 2-table setup. Because what happens is, right, when kids grow, kids ministry, youth ministry, they may want more. They may want to go deeper. They may want to experience shared identity. But when they go to check out the adult table, they quickly realize that maybe they don't have a place there. It's not their time yet. And truth be told, this message isn't only for teenagers. Because I think that there's probably some adults sitting in this room right now. You come to church every single week, but you don't necessarily feel like you fit at the adult table. Like you don't necessarily feel that you even have a seat at the table here. This might be like you're coming, but you're not connecting with anybody. Maybe you feel like you don't have a job. Maybe you feel like you don't really know what your calling is or what your giftings are, and so you kind of lean towards like, I come, it's cool. I don't really understand anything. For some reason, they let the youth pastor preach. You know, all of these things, right? And this is why teenagers and adults, in my mind, are leaving the church at alarming rates. Who do you think suffers as the result? We do. We suffer. The church of God suffers when teenagers and adults leave the church. See, we miss out on the gifts and talents that young people have. We miss out on the wisdom that adults have. And so my hope is that we can kind of land today on a couple options on how we can figure out what our calling is, what our identity is, and how we can move towards that to see the kingdom of God grow in new ways. There's this chapter in Mark chapter 10 that talks a lot about kids. And as I was reading it today, or not today, because I didn't just write this sermon, but maybe I did. When I was reading it, it's very interesting how it's laid out. The beginning part of Mark chapter 10 is talking all about divorce. And the Pharisees are like trying to pin Jesus on how he feels about divorce. Would you agree that's an adult table conversation? Would you agree this is an adult table conversation? Okay, wake up. Okay, and then there's a middle section, and then there's a third section that talks a lot about money. And it's like the rich young ruler and how we put all our efforts into money and all these different things. Would you agree that's basically an adult table conversation? Perfect, you're getting it. The middle section, though, put right between these two sections, there's these kids. They want to come up to Jesus. And his disciples are like, yo, this is an adult table conversation that we're having right now. And Jesus says, no. And he actually gets angry. He's like, let the little children come to me. Why? Because they're the future. Jesus says, they're the reasons why I came. Jesus says, don't push them away from us. And I think that even for adults in this room, there's been a moment when you felt pushed away by a disciple. So my hope is that we can go back to that place that you were when maybe you were pushed away. As Jesus ascends into heaven, we start to learn about this guy named Paul. Paul is one of my favorite authors in the Bible. The reason why, if you were one of my students, you know this. The reason why is because Paul literally lived in a state of anxiousness, probably, constantly, right? Because anytime he opened his mouth, chance of going to jail. That doesn't sound very fun. How many of you guys in this room, anytime you open your mouth, probably are going to go to jail? I knew it, John. I knew you were going to raise your hand, and I set you right up for that. That was awesome. No, but every time he opened his mouth, and then the people he would talk to about Jesus, they're potentially going to jail also. He constantly lived in this state where he couldn't talk about what he wanted to talk about, but yet he still did. And that tells me that this person is someone who we should listen to. Someone that we should pay attention to. This is why our church right now is going through the Praxis series. We're talking about Acts because our church also believes that Paul is someone we should listen to. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, it says this. As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I do not need you. The head cannot say to the feet, I do not need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. What happens to the body if a part is missing? Can it exist? Right? Sure, it can exist. Can it function? Possibly. Can it accomplish good things? Probably. But can it thrive? See, I think, in my own mind, I could probably make it without an arm or a leg, or maybe if I lost a couple toes, I could probably make it. But would I thrive? I don't think so. See, we can get by in this church. We can get by in this church without a drummer. Sorry, Garrett, if you're still in the room. But we truly miss out on something, right? We miss out on something that helps elevate the worship experience and also something that holds us accountable. You see, what Garrett does back there is he's holding the worship band accountable like this. You see, Pastor Brian is the captain, but Garrett and Will and Steve and Rhett and Teddy and Ryden, these are all the rudders. these are the ones that hold it accountable. Every part in the body matters. You need it. You can survive, but you might not thrive. There is a part in the body that you can't survive without, and it's the heart. Because I think what's in our heart actually matters. And when you first start trying to figure out what your calling is, what your identity is, I think a good place to start is in your heart. Because the things in your heart really matter. 1 Samuel 16:7 says, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Young, old, small, tall. This kind of sounds like a Dr. Seuss book, but anywho. First service laughed way louder at that one. You guys are asleep. What is in your heart that's stopping you from taking a seat at the table? What is it? What is in your heart that's stopping you from taking a seat at the table? Is the conversation too boring? Do you not have any friends? Did you maybe not get a personal invite to be a part of the adult table from the pastor? My encouragement is for you to grab a chair, take a seat anyways. See, students in this room, you are called. God has a plan and a purpose for your life. But it requires you to not get annoyed at the things and the conversations that are had at the adult table. They may not play as many games as we do, but as you go through the food line, you're going to have to make this decision. As you begin to walk through this process, especially those of you that are going to college, like you have to make a decision. I'm going to get my food and I'm going to sit at the adult table and I'm going to join in. I'm going to use the gifts and talents that God's given me. And truth be told, this is the same for some of you that are sitting in this room right now. See, you may get your plate, look around the table and be like, I'm actually just going to go sit on the couch. This is cool. Like, I don't really have a place. That's not being a part of the body. That's not being the person that God called you to be. So now we're going to talk about some helpful tips that I think that we can begin to use when we're trying to figure out our calling. First, pray about what part of the body God's called you to be. What part of the body are you? Seek God earnestly in prayer and ask him for wisdom. The Bible's really clear about this. In James 1:5, it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. This verse is telling us like, hey, if you're looking for wisdom, ask me. Students, what do I say about prayer all the time? Noah, go. What do I say about pray real prayers? Pray those type of prayers that you feel almost like, should I even ask this? He already knows what you're thinking. Pray them. God, give me wisdom. Help me figure out what my calling is. Help me figure out where you're sending me next. Next, you need to know who you are in Christ before you can take a seat. What is your identity in? And how do you find it? The relationship between knowing God and knowing ourselves is essential. We see it written all over the Bible, right? Psalms 46:10 has this beautiful verse, be still and know that I am God. As we grow in our knowledge of God, his character, his will, his love, we will inevitably have a deeper understanding of ourselves. Why? Because we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Created in God's image. Unique. This is super important for us to discern our calling. And for us to understand that through God, we can begin to understand what a unique person we actually are. See, I tell this to my students all the time. But Joe, Emmy, Bella, Noah, all of you guys, you're all fearfully and wonderfully made. God has a plan and a purpose for your life, and he wants to use you in new ways. Grab a seat at the table. Our calling or our seat at the table flows from our identity. It does. Many of you guys know my story, but my story is an interesting one. See, it wasn't that long ago that I was living my full life for my achievements, my gratification, my reward. Yes, I was serving Jesus. I was playing on a worship team. We came to church. But I never allowed God to define my calling. Many parts of this spun because my success was my only driver in life. The only thing I actually cared about was my success. And let's be honest, we live in a world where success is pretty high on the docket, right? Like, you want to have a nice car, you want to have a nice house, you want to have nice things. And I'm not saying those are bad, because if I'm being totally honest, I'm still figuring it out, what it looks like to like serve in ministry and also like be a husband and a father. Maybe take my family on vacation someday, right? Like, I'm figuring it out. I'm not saying things are bad, but when they control your every motive, they're wrong. I spun into a deep sense of depression. I was broken. And even though from the eyes of everybody around me, I looked like I had it going on, but I didn't. David Benner, the author of the book, The Gift of Being Yourself, said this. He said, but even more telling, if my self-esteem is threatened and I feel my identity to be a bit vulnerable, my almost automatic first response is to think of the accomplishments or present or future projects. This tells me so much more than I usually care to acknowledge. My identity is based on what I do and not who I am. We live in a world where our identity is based on what we do, not who God's called us to be. So if we're trying to figure out our calling, we have to try to separate ourselves from what we do and insert ourselves into who God's called us to be. Who has God called you to be? In the sense of brokenness, I could finally lean to the Lord and be like, God, what do you want from me? What can I do to get out of this place? How can I learn the call that you have for me? How can I become the most authentic version of myself? Do I have it figured out? Ask my wife. She'll tell you later that I do not yet. But I'm getting there. I'm on the right track. True self versus false self in calling. What the heck is that? Well, I believe if we spend some time trying to understand this journey in our calling, we have to understand that our true self is who we are in Christ, the person that God created us to be. It's characterized by love, humility, and integrity. Our false self, on the other hand, is characterized by selfishness, pride, and deceit. It is the mask that we wear to hide our insecurities. One of my favorite sermon series I have done to date is titled Masks. And we talked a lot about true self versus false self, but we used different words. We talked about hiding behind a chameleon mask. And this is where you put on a mask, maybe when you come to church. Maybe you put on a mask when you go out. Maybe you put on a mask when you're at school. Maybe you put on a mask when you're at work. Maybe you put on a mask even with your family and friends. You put this mask on to prove that you're okay, but the truth of the matter is you're really not. That's your false self. Your true self is who God's called you to be. Knowing the difference is paramount. Romans 12:2 says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Parker Palmer, in his book, Let Your Life Speak, says, what a long time it can take to become the person one has always been. You remember how I said Mark 10? When you were a child, God created you to be something. He says what a long time it can take to become the person you have always been. How often in the process we mask ourselves in faces that are not our own. How much dissolving and shaking of ego we must endure before we can discover our deep identity, the true self within every human being. And then lastly, actively engage and step out. Don't expect that you're just going to be invited. I have a bunch of crazy aunts and uncles in my youth ministry. What this means is when you have those two separate tables, you always have an aunt or an uncle that's like, I can't do this anymore, and they go and get involved in what's happening between the two tables. If you're one of my youth ministry volunteers, I want you to stand up. Okay, this is working. Steve, that's you. I'm going to have to call you guys out by name. These people are the crazy aunts and uncles that are willing to get in the mess and just say, God, I'm going to go after this calling. I'm going to use the gifts and talents that you've given me to pour into the lives of another generation. Actively engage and step out. Imagine what would happen if we had more crazy aunts and uncles who were intentionally interested or invested in the lives of young people. Imagine what would happen. See, I think what would happen is you would have people who don't just exist. You would have people who don't just function through life. You would have people who don't just kind of go to church because they kind of do a good thing. No, you would have people that thrive, because for the church to thrive, everyone needs a place at the table. And we do this well at SBC. I'm so thankful for Pastor Brian and Pastor Rachel, like I said before, because they give our students opportunities to serve and be involved in new ways. But it also requires the students to go to the food line and then go sit at the adult table. Jesus showed us what this looked like, right? Jesus was sitting with his disciples, and he realized that he had all power in all of the earth. And what did he do? We started our service with it. He got down and he served in new ways. He used the calling that God had given him to serve. In what we might think, right? Like if I asked all these boys right now, hey, can I wash your feet? I don't want to wash their feet. I mean, I would, but I don't want to. God has a plan and a purpose for your life. How are you going to determine what that is? Don't just sit idly by. Don't squander your gifts and talents. Use them for his glory. Because if we can thrive in here, we can thrive out there. We can begin by changing our county. We can change our state. We can change our country. And we can change the world. But you got to be willing to ask, what is my calling?
Thanks so much for joining us, church. We hope that you enjoyed this message. If you'd like to hear more messages like this, or if you'd like to partner with us financially, please visit sierrabible.com.